Hello, everybody. My name is Casey Pekas. I'm the director here at the museum and the visitor center. I'd like to welcome you to our second episode of our series, Uniquely Bastrop, to look at the history of the things that make our town and the county the special place that it is. Our presenter today is a native Bastropian and local historian, Ken Keslis. Ken has written numerous books on the history of Bastrop. And so without further ado, I'm going to make Ken our host. And Ken, would you share your screen and you could start your presentation.
Thank you for, I guess you can't say coming, but thank you for tuning in, checking in, dialing in for this second in our series. I want to say something that it's a limitation on my part, and that is when I started working on Bastrop County history, there's like when you travel, there's always something else over the next hill. And I finally decided I had to just limit myself to the present confines of Bastrop County and maybe significant times when Bastrop County people went somewhere else or something else really affected us. So the area that you see with Bastrop there, you're very familiar with that, surrounded by all those other counties. Once Bastrop County was much larger, but that's another story or a story for another day. So that's always my limitation. And when somebody asks me about Fedar or Weberville or San Marcos, I say not in Bastrop County. People that first lived here, whether we call them Native Americans or Indians or maybe 90th century BCE immigrants, there were people living here when Europeans arrived and began permanent settlement. I don't know much at all about Native Americans. This is a picture from probably the late 19th century of a small Tonkawa village. And I picked that because the Tonkawa Indians, named largely by the Europeans, were the primary Amerindians, Native Americans living in this area, the area of present Bastrop County, in the 18th, 17th, and 19th centuries. They were not permanent residents, as very few of the Native Americans in Texas were, but they came and went, used the resources, depleted them, moved on to another place, followed the game, followed the river, followed the pecan trees and bloom, etc. So I put them because they're the primary ones who were here. They were here partly because the Comanches, who were the strongest and most warlike of all the tribes in Texas, ran them out of the hill country and they had to settle here. I put a picture of this guy because he is just an extraordinary person who lived in Bastrop County fairly often because he was, believe it or not, the faithful Indian companion of one of the primary settlers in this area named Edward Burleson. This is, he was so important that when the first Texas Almanac came out and they had woodcuts of 6 or 7 prominent Texans, Placido was one of them. We don't know a great deal about him, but he was a very interesting guy and plays a role in some of our history, as we will see in future episodes. I want to talk about foundations today, and so that what people were here are I have very little knowledge about. There are plenty of archaeological records, but they're very scant and don't tell you very much. Most of what I've concentrated on and most of what we know are after Europeans came to this area. But they came to stay largely because of our natural resources, which are plentiful. This is a aerial view, a satellite view of Hills Prairie. And as you can see, it's very flat. It's left over the white line at the top is the river road that goes down by Tahitian village, and the river runs along it. So everything on the downside of this photograph is prairie, and it was eons of overflow of the river on the low side of the river that created this prairie with very productive soil. And those prairies were helpful because almost everyone that came here were farmers, planters, and they needed, flat ground was great. There was not a lot of trees on the prairies. They had to clear very few of those. And there are places around the county. This is the largest one, but Young's Prairie, Dixon Prairie, there are a number of other prairies that we could highlight by looking at a larger view of this photograph. The in red there, superimposed on a current Bastrop County map, is the Colorado River that you recognize. The river runs and ran at a northwest to southeast angle across the river, with its meanderings that changed as the river flowed and as floods came. But the river was the primary demarcation line for settlers to have land granted to them. It was a kind of highway for the Native Americans and for the early settlers. It provided water, but water was a little less important. Well, in fact, it was a lot less important then than it is today, because the water that they used would have been from wells and from springs in particular. But cattle would have used the river water. The river was, as I said, also a boundary line. When you talk about Texas in the early days, it's up and down the rivers that define who and what the place involves. This is hard to see exactly what it is, but this is a 1908, I think, soil survey map of Bastrop County. And you will see lots and lots of different colors on there. Each color represents a different soil type. We have a rich variety of soil types that allow for a variety of planting, a variety of natural elements to grow and for animals to live within. And this is area out here is Hills Prairie again. The forested area up here, these yellow things are the river bottoms. The soil types are as varied as any place in Texas. Most maps like this, you would see one color or two colors or three colors, but there's, I think, 38 on there. The trees, of course, our forest that we're so familiar with in the last few years because we haven't had them or we see them coming back, was extraordinarily important because the forest was the westernmost stand of loblolly pines or of pine trees of any sort in between the east coast of the United States and some of the mountains in the Mountain West. But of the southern pines, this was the farthest stand to the west. So the farthest west stand of timber that could really be used well for building houses and other structures. The other resource is the Old San Antonio Road, which I will talk a little more about in a moment. But this is the road that was primarily used to go from the United States to Mexico, from San Antonio to Nacogdoches in particular, when Nacogdoches was the entry town to Texas during the Spanish and Mexican days. And as you see, it went right through Bastrop. This is a close-up of the road through the county, although it's not a very good one. But by and large, if you follow Highway 21, within a quarter to a half of a mile, you're on the Old San Antonio Road. It came in from the San Marcos area, came down through this portion of the county, crossed the river here at Bastrop, and continued on towards Page, what's now College Station, Nacogdoches, and so forth. This was the primary road for Texas during the developmental years of Texas as a colony of Mexico and as a republic. This is a map that's a little hard to see because it's kind of turned sideways a little bit. So if you're thinking about a road map, you need to tilt it a bit to the left. The orange road is a road that in the early 1700s, Spanish forged out a trail trying to get from Mexico to the United States. And they followed more or less under the escarpment east of Austin, meaning kind of along Highway 35 until you get up towards Taylor, and then it cut across current Taylor. The bottom one is another road that dipped down and went through the eastern edge of Fayette County and Colorado County and came back up and met the road before it got to Nacogdoches. The reason for the pink one in particular, is because they found it impossible to get through this obstacle they called the Montes. And it was not, it also, that word means mountain, but it also means forest. So as you see on this map to the right of Bastrop, you'll see the pine forest. When they tried to come through Bastrop, which was the most direct route from San Antonio to Nacogdoches, they were unable to get through because of the trees. It was just so difficult. So they called it this forest, this mountain. It was an obstacle for them, and it made it very difficult. So they decided in the first case to go up under the escarpment, but that got them closer and closer to Indian territory, to Comanche territory. And so the next effort they made in the later part of the 1700s was to make this circle that went all the way around the trees so they could not have that obstacle in their way. But it was so many more miles. Well, finally in 1795, what they called the Bastrop cutoff was put through, and it made those other two roads obsolete. So the blue road is the old San Antonio road, the Bastrop cutoff of the main road between the U.S. and Mexico. And it goes, of course, right through Bastrop. So they went through the obstacle, they found a way to do it, they cut their way through, and it was difficult because the trees would often fall on them, but it was still doable, and they used that road, more or less Highway 21 through the forest. Let me back up before I confuse you with that. The fact that the road across the river here is highly significant and the very beginning of Bastrop County, and of all the civilization on the west end of Texas, north of San Antonio, that is. The road crossed here, it went through the forest, and it was the road was primarily used for mail and military purposes. And so in order to try to protect the mail routes, the mail carriers would maybe go 20, 30 miles or so to another post, deliver the mail like the Pony Express, turn around and go back. And they had some soldiers to protect the mail trains. And one of them was stationed for a very short period of time at the crossing of the Colorado in Bastrop. And so the post on the Colorado, Puesta del Colorado, is what they called it around 1807. Zebulon Pike came through in 1805 and noted in his diary. Stephen F. Austin did not know it when he was here in 1821. For years, this building was called the old building that was the fort, the old Spanish fort, they would call it, the post on the Colorado. But unfortunately, it's not. It was nowhere near that large. This building was on the hill, not a hill, it's across from the ferry park, if you will, on College Street. It was a house that was built somewhere in the mid to late 1800s, but it was not the post on the Colorado. This occurs in Bill Moore's Bastrop County book, but it's incorrect. I can understand why they made the mistake, but that's why it's got the line through it. If you see a picture of the post on the Colorado, it's a fake. If you see this, it's incorrect. Where did the road cross the river? Well, if you will see where Gills Branch is, a little bit south of that is where the San Antonio Road crossed the Colorado River. It crossed there because it was about the only place they could get up the bank. And here's what I think happened. If you will go on the current main highway bridge from Walmart over towards the state park, or towards let's say towards Buc-ee's, you'll see a very clear indication of how high the bluff is when you see the Mexican Baptist Church in the distance. It's a 50, 60-foot bluff, very high. And you can imagine how difficult it would have been to get a wagon or horses up there. Eventually, they started building cut banks to make it easier to come up the cliff. But at this point, Gills Branch, which had cut across Bastrop County for eons, had cut down the bank as the mouth of a creek would have to. So they crossed right there at the creek and went up the banks of the creek, which was much an easier and more gentle climb. That's the absolute milepost beginning for everything about Bastrop, is that crossing. As I said, it's if you see that little field just below the word Gills Branch, you'll see about where it crossed. There was a shale crossing just about the same place. It was a really good place to cross the river. If you see above it, just for your reference sake, you can see at the very top of the photograph the current 71 bridge, the Primera Baptist Church, and the Bastrop sewer plant. And I was telling a group one time about where this was and trying to define it by the sewer plant. A lady from Houston asked me, well, why in the world would they cross the river at a sewer plant? And my reply was, I'm sorry, ma'am, I just don't have any idea. So if you don't get the joke, talk to me later. Stephen F. Austin, in the effort to develop Texas as a colony, came through Bastrop in 1821, and he wrote down, but he didn't come through Bastrop. He crossed the river, following the road at what is now Bastrop. And this is the transcription of his journal entry where he talked about how valuable a place it was, how wide the valley was, how well watered it was, how great the number of the trees were around, and the abundance of fish. He compared it with the Cumberland River of West Virginia and Virginia. That's going to become very significant as the story goes forward. But he came through here in 1821 when he came to take the place of his father to develop Bastrop, to develop the colonies of Austin's first colony, the Old 300. This is a photograph, not a photograph, it's a photograph of a painting painted by a famous Texas historian named McCardle. And on the bottom left, you see a guy with a mustache. He's trying to represent the Baron de Bastrop there, who, and Austin, Stephen F. Austin is holding his arm up. He's at his cabin in San Felipe. They're about to grant some land to some of the Old 300. The Baron de Bastrop, who helped Stephen F. Austin and Moses Austin get permission from the Mexican government, is a significant figure in Austin's life, the most important Mexican citizen at that point in his life. And so this portrays him as the land commissioner for Austin's little colony, which is his service to Austin comes into play later as well. What Austin was trying to do, and this green is my attempt to kind of show where Bastrop County as it now exists lays out in terms of the road. You see the road in red, you see the river in black, and the yellow is the area that Stephen F. Austin was given to develop with those 300 colonists. It went from the coast, the Gulf Coast, up to the San Antonio Road, only to the edge of the San Antonio Road, and in the valleys of the Brazos and Colorado River, which meant where the watershed is, that is where the water, say to the south of us, starts flowing into the Lavaca or Guadalupe River, that's where the land ended. The same thing between the Trinity and the Brazos. You're seeing a dark line there. That's the watershed line between the Brazos and the Trinity. The water that fell on the clear, unyellow side of the map went into the Trinity River, into the Gulf. That which fell on the left side went into the Brazos. So he had that area to develop. And that you see a corner of Bastrop County, or two corners of it, almost half, in the eastern side of Bastrop County, lay within his original colony, except for another colony which is sort of questionable, which we'll talk about when we talk about the colonies. So those are the foundation stones, I think, which provided for us the most important ingredients for what the European settlers, the American settlers, found when they got here. So I'm going to ask Kay if anybody has typed in any questions that I need to address.
I haven't gotten any as of yet. So if you'd like to ask a question, you could go ahead and do that in the question answer area or in the chat area.
So while you're looking, I'll go back and tell a well-told story that Moses Austin got the idea to come to Texas and develop some American, mostly Southern colonists. He went to Mexico, or to the town of San Antonio, which was the state capital of that part of Mexico, and asked for permission. And the governor just turned him down flat. But he happened in his discouragement to run into a man he had known in the United States years before, who was named Philip Nearing Bogle, but he went by the nomenclature Baron de Bastrop, a made-up name, I think. But he recognized Austin. He asked him what was going on. Austin told him, and Austin had been told to get out of town. And Bastrop said, well, don't go yet. Come stay with me. I'm going to go see the governor. So he went back to see the governor and convinced the governor he ought to talk to Moses Austin again. And because of that connection, the governor was able to trust Moses Austin, and he was able to get the grant for this original colony that's in yellow on this slide. Eventually, Moses Austin died before he could settle anyone, and the job of settling the 300 settlers in the original colony fell to Stephen F. Austin. And the Baron de Bastrop, as I said earlier, became his land commissioner, his primary confidant, eventually his representative, or Texas's representative in the state legislature of Texas and Coahuila. So Bastrop's a very, very important person in the early history of Texas. People called Stephen F. Austin the father of Texas, and if so, maybe the Baron de Bastrop is the godfather of Texas.
I have two questions for you, Ken.
Let's go. And while we're there, there's my contact information. You can call me anytime after this meeting or whenever and ask any other questions or tell me something I don't know. Okay.
Okay, so first question, clarification on when and where the Spanish fort was built.
Somewhere in the early 1800s. It was gone by 1812, and I think 1807, if I remember correctly, is the first reference, or maybe 1805 is the first reference to it. There's very, very little known about it. It was part of a larger installation on the San Marcos River, where San Marcos is now. And this was sort of an outpost of that. There were a few people here, 5, 6, maybe no more. There's reference to some Indians that were Native Americans who were staying around there, probably trading. It had been very small. It was probably somewhere around where the state highway bridge crosses the river. So somewhere up on that bluff, somewhere near the crossing, but up on high ground. Okay.
And another question, what about the crossing at the end of Lover's Lane, Old Camp Ford Road?
Yeah, the old Campground Ford campground for it. The campground was across the river from that road. It's called Lover's Lane now. That was the direct route to Hills Prairie if you wanted to go from Bastrop, as you can tell by just looking at the map. And that was the crossing that went for a long time. There was a ferry there fairly early on because Hills Prairie was one of the first places to develop for reasons that I've stated. So it would have been, I've forgotten when the first ferry was in there, but it was pretty early on in the 1840s, maybe sooner. And so there was the crossing there was a result of not people traveling anywhere except between Hills Prairie and the town of Bastrop.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any others yet.
And just to say, campground in the days of the in the 1800s, people for recreation and for revivals and that sort of thing would go to the bottom over there, and they were allowed by the owner to camp out there. So there were people would go for just to cool off in the summer, to have reunions, to have revivals and so forth. So it became known as the campground over there. And so the road out to the campground was called Campground Ford Road because they forded to get to the campground from the Bastrop side.
I have another question.
Yep.
Did Stephen F. Austin ever have a home in Bastrop County or Travis County? I know he was in jail in Mexico.
Yeah, no, he lived down, he developed the town of San Felipe de Austin. He eventually lived with his relatives at the Warner plantation down in, I think, Fort Bend County. He owned property, for example, Tahitian Village, that he owned that. He owned the area just upriver from Bastrop. He owned property he claimed property in the Austin area, the town of Austin area. He never lived on any of it, and he never lived anywhere near around here. He died in 1836, before much was going on here. And he might have moved up here at some point if he'd lived, but he had a great place. He'd have lived up on the hill at Tahitian Village, probably looking over his plantation.
Thank you.
He never got here.
Another request to talk about the Jenkins family.
Well, we could talk about the Jenkins family. We'll say that the Jenkins family settled. Edward Jenkins got a grant for what is really most of Hills Prairie now. He managed to die before he really developed it. His widow sold half of it to the Hills, who had lots of money, and it became Hills Prairie because they stuck and they had a lot of name recognition. So Jenkins Prairie, which it was once called, ceased to be anything but a name lost to history. The Jenkinses are a subject in itself. Primarily, we know a lot about the Jenkinses because they've been prominent members of the Jenkins family in Bastrop County history, but mostly because of John Holland Jenkins, who wrote his reminiscences in the 1880s, and his daughter-in-law transcribed them and probably cleaned them up and put them in good English and with good punctuation, published them in the Bastrop Advertiser in the 1880s. The transcripts eventually got given to the University of Texas Library, where they served as a primary source for Bastrop and more than Bastrop, early Texas history from the earliest days through 1847, when he decided it was too late. That was too late to even talk about, too current, anything after 1847. So, and then his great-great-great-grandson edited, annotated, and published those reminiscences in the late 1950s, and it's ever since been a primary source in printed form of early Texas history.
Okay, here's another one. When did the Kessless family get here? Were they really outlaws?
No, they were God-fearing, tax-paying, wonderful people. Don't you imagine? My first ancestor that came was named William Kessel. He came to Bastrop in 1853 or a little after. By 1857, he had a tailor shop and had changed his name by adding a U.S. on the end of it because he was mad at his family, wanted to differentiate himself from them, and loved his new country, the United States, which Texas was now part of the United States by then. And then there's been a presence, I guess, of Custis's ever since that point. He's got an interesting story to tell, which maybe I'll mention if we survive till the Civil War.
We will. So I do want to mention that Michael said that Jenkins's book is available still for sale on Thrift Books, if anybody was interested in knowing or buying that.
Do I have time to tell a story?
Well, sure. People can. It is 12:30, so I want to be 12:31. So if anyone needs to head out, the time is to 12:30. So, but go for it. There's some people.
So here's the story. John Jenkins, who's the person that annotated, edited, and published the Jenkins memoirs, gave me a photograph of John Holland Jenkins and his wife Mary Jane to use in my first Bastrop County book. So I put it on page 237, and there it is, John Holland and Mary Jane Jenkins, courtesy John Jenkins III. And there it is. So a few years after that, his long-lost cousin came to town. She was a decorator for Mary Jane, maybe? No, that's wrong. Janie, anyway, whatever. She came to town to visit and said, "Isn't it too bad that we don't have a photograph of Mary Jane Jenkins?" And he says, "Oh, I have one." She says, "No, come on." And he pulls out that photograph, and she says, "No, Johnny, that's not our Jenkins ancestors. That's our Holmes ancestors." He says, "Oh, no, this is John Holland and Mary Jane Jenkins." She says, "No, it's not." He says, "Yes, it is." She says, "No, it's not." He says, "Yes, it is." She says, "No, it's not." He walks over, pulls out my book, turns to page 237 and says, "Now it is." But it turns out that it wasn't. The only place that's ever been seen outside the family is in that book. The University of Texas Press, I'm embarrassed to say, took that photograph and ran it on the cover of the latest paperback edition of the Jenkins memoirs, without citation and without permission. It took us about 10 years to convince them that they had made a horrible mistake. So that picture's run all over the country as if it were John Holland and Mary Jane Jenkins, when it is instead Mr. and Mrs. Holmes. And it's just by the way, my phone number's wrong on this thing. For me, it's just a fabulous story of mistaken identity. And John, of course, didn't mean to say, because it was printed, it was the truth. But the fact that the University of Texas Press would do something like that at least when they did it was illegal. I hear the statutes of limitation have long passed, and put us off for so long on being able to admit what they had done. It's a little embarrassing for someone who's a UT graduate. So there's a good Aggie story for you if you want to use it. My phone number is 512-940-7897, 940, and the email is correct. So I'll quit talking, I guess, whatever case shuts me up, but that's the last story I can think of.
Okay, I just have two other things to say. One is we received comments that great job and many thanks from the Helmicks. So thank you, Ken. And hopefully we can do these in person one day soon, at least partially, and maybe a combination of both. So thank you all for joining in. I can't say thanks enough to all of our members, many of who are on this call today. So thanks again, Ken. You want to have any last minute comments? What's next time?
Next time is I don't remember, but I think it's the development of the town of Bastrop. Is that right?
I believe so.
Sounds good.
Yep. So I hope you all join in next time. We'll see you in October 15th. Thanks,
Everybody.